In the winter of 1939, as Europe teetered on the edge of chaos, a quiet Finnish farmer shouldered his rifle and stepped into history. He wasn't a soldier by training, nor a man who sought glory. Yet over the course of just 100 days, this unassuming villager would earn a name that chilled Soviet troops to their core: the White Death. While Stalin's Red Army boasted more men, more tanks, and more planes than Finland could ever imagine, they faced something they could neither see nor understand: a single marksman who turned the frozen forests into his own battlefield. This is the story of Simo Häyhä, a man who defied the largest army on earth with patience, precision, and a rifle older than many of the men he faced. But behind the legend lies something even more remarkable: the mindset, the ingenuity, and the quiet courage that transformed a humble farmer into a symbol of endurance. If you're fascinated by real stories of resilience and strategy, not myths, but moments where ordinary people shaped history, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves uncovering the human side of war. Your support helps us tell more untold stories like this, where courage, not numbers, changed the course of history. In the final months of 1939, as Europe trembled under the shadow of Hitler's conquests, another storm was quietly gathering in the north. Finland, a young, fiercely independent nation carved from centuries of struggle, stood watchful along its eastern border. On the other side loomed a giant: the Soviet Union, ruled by Joseph Stalin, whose empire stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific. Officially, the two nations were at peace. Unofficially, Stalin's gaze had already settled on the narrow strip of land that separated Leningrad from Finland's frontier. To the Soviet leader, that distance was a danger, and he intended to erase it. For Stalin, the logic was simple, at least on paper. The Soviet Union had just signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. In his view, Finland fell comfortably within Moscow's reach. He demanded territorial concessions: islands in the Gulf of Finland, a chunk of the Karelian Isthmus, and a 30-year lease on a naval base. To the Kremlin, these were defensive measures. To the Finns, they were nothing less than a surrender of sovereignty. When Helsinki refused, Stalin's patience ended. On November 26, 1939, a mysterious artillery shell landed near a Soviet border post at Main. Moscow blamed Finland. The Finns protested innocence and called for an investigation. Stalin ignored them. The incident was a fabrication, a convenient excuse for invasion. 4 days later, 500,000 Red Army troops crossed the border. On paper, it looked like a slaughter waiting to happen. The Soviet Union commanded one of the largest military forces on Earth, over 1 million men, thousands of tanks, and an air fleet capable of leveling cities. Finland, by comparison, had barely 300,000 soldiers, most of them reservists or volunteers. Its armored corps numbered fewer than 40 tanks, many of them outdated relics from the 1920s. The world watched with pity. Foreign correspondents predicted that Finland would fall within 2 weeks. Stalin himself believed it would take less. Yet behind the numbers lay a truth: the Soviet generals overlooked Finland's greatest weapon was not its army, but its terrain, its climate, and its unyielding national spirit. Winter had arrived early that year, and it came with a vengeance. Temperatures plummeted below -40°C. Lakes froze into solid plates of ice. Forests turned into white labyrinths. And even the air seemed to crystallize in the lungs. For Soviet troops, many of them conscripts from Ukraine and Central Asia, the cold was an enemy more merciless than the Finns. They wore thin wool coats and carried little protection against frostbite. Engines refused to start. Lubricants froze solid. Entire columns stalled along forest roads where snowdrifts rose higher than tanks. In contrast, Finnish soldiers moved like ghosts. Dressed in white camouflage, gliding silently on skis, they struck from the trees, vanished into the mist, and left nothing but confusion in their wake. To the rest of the world, the Winter War, as it came to be known, was a mismatch between a giant and an ant. But to those who fought in it, it became something else entirely: a testament to ingenuity, endurance, and raw human will. The Finns called that spirit sisu, a word without perfect translation, meaning a blend of courage, determination, and quiet defiance in the face of the impossible. As Soviet columns burned in the snow and their commanders realized that brute strength could not conquer the forests of Karelia, a legend began to take root. Among the thousands of Finnish volunteers preparing to defend their homeland, one name would soon stand apart, not for rank or rhetoric, but for sheer, silent precision. His name was Simo Häyhä, and before long, his rifle would speak louder than any army. When the first Soviet shells fell on Helsinki on November 30, 1939, the world woke to headlines that seemed both absurd and inevitable. A tiny Nordic republic of farmers and foresters was now at war with one of the greatest powers on earth. Yet Finland did not panic. There were no parades, no fiery speeches. Instead, a calm determination settled over the nation, a quiet resolve that this land, carved by ice and history, would not surrender easily. Men packed rifles, women prepared winter gear, and entire towns volunteered to fortify defenses. Even children helped build roadblocks. It was not defiance born of arrogance, but of necessity. For the Finns, there was simply nowhere left to retreat. The Soviets struck along a 1,000-kilometer front, expecting Finland to crumble. They rolled forward with divisions bristling with tanks and aircraft, convinced that sheer mass would sweep aside any resistance. But almost immediately, things went wrong. The Red Army's generals had planned their invasion on maps. Clean, flat diagrams that ignored the brutal truth of Finland's landscape. The roads were narrow ribbons cutting through endless forests. The lakes and marshes, frozen solid, concealed deadly traps. Soviet tanks advanced in long, clumsy columns, unable to maneuver off-road, and in those forests waited the defenders, small units of Finnish ski troops, who knew every ridge, every path, every shadowed glade. The first encounters stunned the invaders. Soviet soldiers, trudging through waist-deep snow, were ambushed by white-clad figures who seemed to appear from nowhere. A few bursts of gunfire, a grenade, and then silence. When reinforcements arrived, they found their comrades frozen where they fell. The Finns struck quickly and vanished just as fast, their skis leaving barely a trace. They called these hit-and-run operations Marty tactics, breaking larger Soviet formations into isolated logs, encircling them, and cutting them down one by one. What began as a defensive measure soon became an art of war, perfectly suited to the frozen wilderness. For the Red Army, used to open plains and set-piece battles, the forest was a nightmare. Tanks became coffins when the engines froze. Artillery was useless when targets refused to stand still. Soldiers lit fires to keep warm, only to draw sniper fire the moment the flames flickered. Commanders grew desperate, throwing men into the woods with little direction and less hope. Meanwhile, Finnish morale only hardened. Each small victory, each destroyed column, became proof that the impossible could be done. Radio broadcasts carried stories of bravery, a handful of men halting entire battalions, and in every village, people listened, clinging to belief. Still, Finland's situation was perilous. Ammunition ran low, food supplies thinned, and every casualty hit harder than numbers could show. Yet amid the exhaustion and the cold, something extraordinary began to emerge. In the ranks of Finland's defenders, individuals with rare skill and ingenuity started to shine. Mechanics who could repair tanks with scrap metal, scouts who could navigate by starlight, and marksmen whose patience defied human endurance. Among them, in a small regiment near the Karelian front, a farmer named Simo Häyhä quietly took his place. Unknown to anyone, this soft-spoken man from Rotjärvi was about to change the psychology of warfare itself, not with bombs or machines, but with a single rifle and an unshakable will. Before the war, Simo Häyhä's life was quiet, almost invisible, the kind of life that leaves no mark in history books. He was born in 1905 in a small village near Rotjärvi, close to Finland's southeastern border. The landscape there was a tangle of pine forests, frozen lakes, and rugged hills, harsh but beautiful. Like most Finns of his generation, Simo grew up working the land. He farmed, hunted, and learned to endure the cold that shaped both body and spirit. Those who knew him described a modest man, short and reserved, with a sharp eye and an unassuming confidence. No one could have imagined that this quiet farmer would one day become one of the most feared figures in modern military history. Simo's skill with a rifle was not born in a classroom or a barracks. It was forged through patience and practice. Hunting in Finland's dense forests demanded absolute precision. A missed shot meant lost food, wasted effort, or a wounded animal that vanished into the snow. Over the years, he became a marksman of rare consistency. In his 20s, he joined the Civil Guard, Finland's local defense organization, where shooting competitions were a point of national pride. There, he refined his technique, calm breathing, controlled trigger pressure, and near-perfect stillness. In these competitions, Simo didn't boast or brag. He simply shot, quietly, methodically, and almost always won. When war finally came, his country called on men like him, not professional soldiers, but citizens who understood the land better than any general. When he joined the 34th Infantry Regiment in late 1939, he carried little more than his standard-issue rifle, the Finnish M28-30, a variant of the old Russian muzzle. It wasn't fancy, but Simo trusted it. When offered a scoped rifle, the latest Soviet model with magnification optics, he politely refused. Too many, it seemed foolish. Scopes allowed for better aim at long distances. But Simo understood something the manuals didn't. A scope's glass could catch the weak Arctic sun and give away a sniper's position. It could fog when warm breaths met the freezing air, and it forced the shooter to raise his head slightly higher, a fatal detail in a world of snow and silence. Iron sights, though simple, were reliable. They didn't reflect, they didn't mist, and they kept his profile low. In war, simplicity could mean survival. What truly set he apart was not just his accuracy, but his innovation. He adapted to the environment with a kind of instinctive genius. Before taking a shot, He would pack snow in front of his barrel and pour water over it, letting it freeze into a solid sheet of ice. When he fired, no puff of snow betrayed his position. He carried a small ball of snow in his mouth to cool his breath, preventing visible vapor from revealing him in the cold air. Every movement was deliberate, every detail considered. Where others saw only discomfort, Simo found opportunity. The cold, the silence, the endless white, these were not obstacles, but allies. And so, as the winter war deepened and Soviet troops pressed further into the forests of Karelia, the legend began. At first, no one paid much attention to the quiet man in white camouflage who disappeared each dawn with his rifle and returned each night with a modest report. 5 today, he would say, or maybe 8. But soon, the numbers became impossible to ignore. His fellow soldiers began to whisper. Officers sent observers to confirm his claims. And one by one, the confirmations came back. The farmer from Rotjarvi was not just lucky, he was rewriting the rules of warfare. Somewhere in those frozen woods, the world's deadliest marksman had taken aim. By December 1939, the front lines of the winter war had hardened into a frozen labyrinth of trenches, shattered trees, and endless snowfields. Temperatures plunged below -40 degrees Celsius. Even seasoned soldiers found the cold unbearable. Rifles froze, food solidified, and the air itself seemed to cut like glass. In this vast, silent expanse, the Red Army's strength meant little. Columns of Soviet troops struggled through waist-deep snow, their green uniforms stark against the white landscape. They were fighting not only an enemy, but the land itself. And somewhere within that land, invisible and patient, Simo Häyhä watched. Each morning before dawn, Simo rose in his snow-covered dugout, ate a piece of rye bread and sugar, and set off on skis toward the front. He carried his rifle, a submachine gun, and little else. Finding a small hollow or a fallen tree, he would pack down the snow, freeze it to mask, muzzle flash, and wait. Sometimes for hours. Sometimes for an entire day. In that stillness, he became part of the landscape, just another patch of white among countless others. Soviet soldiers, already unnerved by the eerie quiet of the Finnish forests, would feel only the sudden crack of a rifle shot and see one of their own fall. There was no flash, no plume of smoke, no second shot. Only silence, the most terrifying sound of all. At first, Soviet commanders dismissed the reports. One man, they reasoned, could not cause such damage. But then, patterns emerged. Patrols vanished without warning. Entire platoons refused to advance into certain sectors. The troops began to whisper about a ghost, a pale figure who appeared from the snow and vanished into thin air. They called him Belaya Smrt, the White Death. The nickname spread faster than any bullet, carried by rumor, fear, and the confessions of trembling survivors. To the Soviets, he became less a man than a myth, a spirit of the forest, exacting vengeance for every inch of frozen ground they stole. The Finnish High Command, meanwhile, began to take notice. Reports credited he with an astonishing number of confirmed kills, -25 in a single day, 38 on Christmas. Officers double-checked his accounts, sending witnesses to verify each tally. Every time, they returned speechless. Simo's methods were as disciplined as they were deadly. He never fired twice from the same position, always relocating after a shot. When artillery rained down on his last known spot, he was already hundreds of meters away, preparing his next ambush. His precision was unmatched, his calm, unshakable. One observer described him as utterly without fear, though Simo himself denied it. "I was just doing my job," he said years later, as if his job had not been dismantling an army, one soldier at a time. But beyond the statistics, it was the psychological effect that made Häyhä's presence so devastating. Soviet morale began to collapse under the weight of the unseen. Soldiers dreaded patrol duty, knowing that somewhere, beyond the trees, a rifle might already be aimed at their hearts. They refused to light fires, afraid of drawing the attention of the phantom Finn. Some froze to death in their trenches rather than risk revealing warmth. Even officers, proud, iron-disciplined men, began to break. One Soviet diary found after the war contained a simple line: "We do not fear shells. We fear silence." And in that silence, Simo Häyhä thrived. The legend of the White Death was no longer a story whispered in fear. It was a reality that reshaped the battlefield. By January 1940, the snow-laden forests of Karelia had become a place of dread for Soviet troops. What had once been a front line now felt like a haunted wilderness, where death came without warning. Soldiers spoke of a ghostly sniper who could see through trees, through mist, through fear itself. Campfires were forbidden, conversations whispered, and movements slowed to a crawl. Even in the presence of thousands, each man felt alone, watched. That psychological weight was Simo Häyhä's greatest weapon. The legend of the White Death had grown far beyond one man's rifle. It had become a force of nature. The Red Army's command was desperate to end it. Counter-sniper teams were formed, elite shooters with new Tokarev rifles and optical scopes. They combed the forests, scanning for the faintest trace of movement. But Simo's mastery of concealment made him almost untraceable. His camouflage was flawless, a blend of snow, cloth, and instinct. He moved only when the wind rustled the trees, fired only when the sound of artillery masked the report of his rifle. His breath never steamed in the cold air, his muzzle never disturbed the snow. Against men relying on glass optics, he was invisible. The counter-snipers who went looking for him often became his next victims. For Simo, each mission followed the same rhythm: silence, patience, and one perfect shot. Yet this was not a detached profession for him. It was survival. He later said he never felt hatred toward those he shot. To him, it was simply war, a brutal necessity to protect his homeland. But for the Soviets on the receiving end, it was something far more personal. Their morale cracked under the relentless precision of a man they could neither find nor understand. Entire platoons refused orders to patrol wooded areas where the White Death was rumored to operate. One captured Red Army soldier confessed, "You cannot fight what you cannot see. We shoot at ghosts." The Finnish soldiers who fought near Häyhä sector spoke of him with quiet awe. He was not boastful, not even particularly talkative. He preferred isolation, spending entire days lying motionless under snow, a simple man who had turned patience into a weapon. At night, he returned to camp exhausted, frostbitten, and silent. When asked for his tally, he would give small numbers, 5, 10. But officers who tracked his confirmed kills realized the magnitude of what he was achieving. Within just a few weeks, Häyhä's total had surpassed 200. By February, it exceeded 400. By early March, over 500 confirmed sniper kills, a record that still stands unbroken. And these figures didn't count the hundreds he cut down with his Suomi submachine gun during close encounters. As stories of his feats spread through Finnish ranks, Simo became a symbol, proof that courage and skill could defy overwhelming odds. Newspapers printed tales of his icy patience. Foreign reporters, hearing rumors of a lone sniper halting an army, dubbed him the White Death. To his countrymen, he was a quiet reassurance that the human spirit could outlast machines. To the enemy, he was something else entirely, an invisible terror, the embodiment of the frozen wilderness that refused to yield. And as winter deepened, that terror only grew. For the Soviets, every rustle of snow, every shift of wind carried menace. They learned to fear the forest itself, because somewhere in those trees, unseen and waiting, was a small Finnish farmer with a steady hand and a heart of iron. By mid-February 1940, the Soviet command had reached its breaking point. Entire divisions had been shredded in the forests of Karelia. Frozen corpses littered the snow, weapons seized by the cold, and morale had sunk 2 levels unseen in modern warfare. Reports of the White Death circulated through every regiment, a single sniper who had claimed hundreds of lives. The Soviets had thrown machine guns, mortars, and even artillery at him. But nothing seemed to stop the invisible farmer who turned the tundra into a killing ground. To Moscow, this was no longer merely a nuisance, it was humiliation. Stalin's army, the pride of the Red Empire, was being mocked by a man with an old bolt-action rifle. Determined to end the embarrassment, Soviet High Command escalated the hunt. They dispatched specialized counter-sniper platoons, 30 of their best marksmen, armed with scopes, supported by heavy weapons and reconnaissance units. Their sole mission, find and eliminate Simo Häyhä. Artillery batteries were ordered to blanket entire sections of forest where a single rifle shot was heard. Each tree line that crackled with gunfire was pulverized by shells within minutes. Still, the Phantom endured. Häyhä's discipline and intimate knowledge of terrain allowed him to outthink and outlast every attempt. He built decoy hides, shifted positions after every shot, and even baited Soviet patrols into ambushes where Finnish ski troops lay waiting. It became a duel between overwhelming force and perfect patience, and patience kept winning. But the Red Army was learning. Slowly, painfully, it began to adapt. Soviet commanders abandoned rigid formations and started moving under cover of darkness, spreading their troops to minimize casualties. When snipers were spotted, they unleashed massive bombardments, sacrificing precision for brute survival. On the ground, Soviet soldiers began firing randomly into forests, hoping to flush out their unseen enemy. The result was chaos. Thousands of rounds wasted, nerves frayed, but sometimes it worked. Even Simo was not invincible. In late February, one of these indiscriminate shellings nearly buried him alive under snow and splinters. When he emerged hours later, bleeding and shaken, he simply brushed the ice from his coat, slung his rifle, and returned to his position. His comrades recalled his words with disbelief. They were loud today. As winter tightened its grip, the forests turned from battlegrounds into graveyards. The Soviet soldiers, terrified and demoralized, began to break under psychological strain. Many refused to advance, others deserted into the snow, choosing death over another day under the White Death's gaze. Finnish patrols found diaries filled with despair. One note, later preserved in Helsinki's war archives, read, "The silence is worse than the bullets. When it comes, you know he is near." That silence, that waiting terror, had become the Finns' most potent weapon. Simo was not just killing men, he was unraveling an army's resolve. Still, the relentless Soviet machine pressed forward. Stalin demanded progress, no matter the cost. More shells, more troops, more blood. The forests of Karelia shook under constant bombardment, the snow blackened by fire. When one sector fell quiet, it wasn't peace, it was the pause before another storm. And through it all, somewhere amid the wreckage, Simo Häyhä continued his grim duty. Each shot was deliberate, each breath measured. And though he never sought fame or vengeance, every trigger pull echoed across the Soviet lines as a reminder. One man, properly hidden, could shake an empire. By February's end, the Winter War had reached its cruelest stage. The Red Army, though battered, was unrelenting. Exhausted, was bleeding from every front. Yet even as the lines trembled and ammunition dwindled, the story of one man began to lift an entire nation's spirit. Simo Häyhä was no longer just a soldier, he had become a symbol. His legend spread from the frozen trenches to the villages far behind the lines. Newspapers, desperate to boost morale, called him the guardian of Finland's snows, the man who turned winter itself into a weapon. And for a people standing alone against the Soviet giant, that image mattered as much as any victory. Within the ranks, his feats seemed almost impossible to believe. 5 kills before breakfast, 38 in a single day. Entire enemy patrols wiped out before they even saw him. The story spread, growing with each retelling, until Simo was seen not just as a man, but as a myth, an embodiment of sisu, that untranslatable Finnish word for endurance, courage, and the will to keep fighting long after logic says to stop. Yet behind the legend, the truth was simpler. Simo did not fight for glory, nor out of hatred. He fought because the Red Army had crossed into his homeland, because behind him lay his farm, his village, and everything he knew worth defending. As his confirmed kills climbed past 500, his superiors finally broke their usual silence. They promoted him, not by 1 or 2 ranks, but all the way from corporal to second lieutenant. The fastest promotion in Finland's history. For a moment, even amidst the devastation, the army had something to celebrate. The newspapers published his name. Commanders praised his example, but Simo himself seemed uncomfortable with the attention. When an officer congratulated him, he simply nodded and said, "I was only doing what I was told." To him, his achievements weren't heroic, they were duty. Nothing more. Meanwhile, to the Soviets, he had become an obsession. Every report of their losses mentioned the same nickname, Belaya Smrt, the White Death. Fear of him had reshaped their tactics. Commanders began moving troops only under artillery cover. Snipers refused assignments in his sector. Even the Red Army's propaganda machine, designed to dismiss Finnish resistance as futile, could not silence the whispers among its soldiers. The fear was too deep, too personal, and that fear had strategic value. For every soldier terrified into hesitation, for every patrol that refused to move, the Finns gained another precious hour to regroup, to reinforce, to survive. In truth, Simo's legend had become larger than his rifle. He represented something Finland desperately needed, proof that the human spirit could stand against impossible odds. He was a reminder that courage could be quiet, that victory did not always belong to the biggest army, but sometimes to the smallest man who refused to yield. And though the front lines rumbled with artillery and the forests burned black under Soviet fire, one man's calm precision continued to echo louder than any explosion. Simo Häyhä, the farmer, the soldier, the White Death, had become the soul of a nation's resistance. March 6, 1940, the 100th day of the Winter War. The forests of Karelia echoed with the dull thunder of Soviet artillery, a ceaseless barrage meant to break Finland's final lines of defense. Amid the chaos, Simo Häyhä took up his usual position near the village of Kala, a place already soaked in blood and legend. The ground trembled beneath the constant shelling. Smoke rose from the trees like black snow, and still, the small Finnish sniper crawled into the white, calm as ever. He had done this nearly every day for months. He had watched thousands advance and fall. This was no different, or so it seemed. By then, Häyhä's name had spread even within Soviet ranks. Some officers spoke of him with contempt, others with fear. Rumors claimed he could see through trees, that bullets curved for him, that the cold itself shielded his aim. The truth was simpler. Simo relied only on discipline, timing, and silence. That morning, he lined up his sights as he always did, his breath steady, the barrel resting on frozen snow. Each trigger pull was routine, each shot a mechanical perfection. But somewhere beyond the smoke, a Soviet countersniper had been waiting. The Red Army had learned his methods, studied his patience, and now one of their best had chosen the perfect moment to strike back. It happened in an instant. As Simo adjusted his aim toward a faint movement ahead, a single explosive bullet tore through the air. The round struck him in the lower left jaw and detonated. The impact was catastrophic. His cheekbone shattered, his jaw disintegrated. The shock threw him backward into the snow, his rifle still in hand. Blood and fragments stained the white around him. For a few seconds, he felt nothing, only a strange warmth spreading across his face, followed by darkness. His comrades, seeing the blast from a distance, believed him dead. When they reached him, half his face was gone. They carried what they thought was a corpse to the field line, leaving behind the silent patch of snow that had once been his battlefield. But the White Death wasn't finished yet. Hours later, as the medics checked the bodies for survivors, one soldier noticed movement, a faint twitch of a hand. Simo was still breathing, barely against every expectation. The man who had haunted an empire refused to die. He was rushed to a field hospital, slipping in and out of consciousness, as doctors fought to keep him alive. For days, he hovered between life and death. When he finally awoke, it was March 13th, the same day Finland signed the Moscow Peace Treaty, ending the Winter War. The sniper who had defended his homeland for 100 days had opened his eyes on the day the guns fell silent. The war was over, but Simo's battle had only begun. The left side of his face was destroyed. His jaw had to be reconstructed from fragments of bone. He spent months in hospitals, undergoing surgery after surgery, his face slowly pieced together like a shattered mosaic. Yet through it all, he never complained. When visitors asked if he regretted fighting, he answered softly, "I did what I was told." It was not pride, nor sorrow, just fact. For him, duty had always been simple: protect the land he loved, whatever the cost. And that cost, now etched into his face, became the visible proof of Finland's endurance. Though the bullet had ended his war, it had also sealed his legend. The Soviets had silenced his rifle, but not his name. The man they called the White Death had survived the impossible once more, scarred, broken, but unyielding. And in the silence that followed the ceasefire, Finland looked upon him not as a ghost of war, but as a living symbol of what it meant to endure. When the guns finally fell silent, Finland stood battered, but unbroken. The Moscow Peace Treaty had forced the nation to surrender 11% of its territory, including the forests and fields. Simo Häyhä once called home, yet the country's spirit remained intact. For Simo, recovery became his new battlefield. He spent months in hospitals, his face reconstructed piece by Finnish surgeons who marveled that he was even alive. Skin grafts, bone reconstruction, endless pain. Each operation was a small act of defiance. When he finally looked into a mirror again, the reflection was that of a man permanently marked by war, his left cheek sunken and scarred. But behind the wounds, his blue eyes were unchanged, calm, steady, the same eyes that had peered down a rifle barrel in the snow. The army offered him retirement with honors. He accepted quietly, preferring the solitude of the countryside over the applause of generals. His old farm near Rotjarvi had been ceded to the Soviets. So the government granted him new land in the west, a gesture of gratitude for his service. There, surrounded by forests and silence, Simo returned to what he had always been: a farmer, a hunter, a man of the land. The war had taken his face, but it had not taken his love for the wilderness. He bred hunting dogs, tended his crops, and spent long winters skiing through the woods. Neighbors described him as polite, reserved, and content to live unnoticed. The same patience that had made him a deadly sniper now shaped his quiet life of simplicity. As Finland rebuilt, journalists and historians began to seek him out. Foreign correspondents traveled from Europe and America, eager to meet the man whose legend had terrified the Red Army. They expected a grim soldier, perhaps a man hardened by violence. Instead, they found a small, soft-spoken farmer who preferred to talk about dogs and hunting rather than war. When asked how he had achieved over 500 confirmed kills, he smiled faintly and said a single word: practice. It was not arrogance, just truth, delivered with the same unadorned honesty that had defined his entire life. When pressed about whether he regretted killing so many, his answer never changed: "I did what I was told, as well as I could." It was this humility, not his accuracy, that left the deepest impression on those who met him. Though he never returned to combat, Simo remained connected to Finland's defense community. Younger soldiers occasionally visited him, seeking advice on marksmanship or discipline. He would demonstrate how to breathe, how to steady one's hand, how to listen to the silence. They came expecting secrets of war. They left understanding, patience. He never spoke of hatred, nor glory, only focus. In his later years, as new conflicts raged across the world and technology reshaped warfare, Simo watched with quiet amusement. When a reporter once asked what he thought of modern warfare with drones, satellites, and guided missiles, he chuckled softly and replied, "It's all the same. You still have to see your target." By the 1990s, he had become something more than a veteran. He was a living piece of history, Finland's quiet reminder of endurance and restraint. He lived simply in his wooden home in Ruokolahti, surrounded by mementos of the past: his dogs, his skis, and his old M2830 rifle, still clean and functional. Time had taken his strength, but not his stillness. When he passed away in 2002, at the age of 96, Finland mourned not just a soldier, but a symbol of its national spirit. His funeral was modest, attended by soldiers, farmers, and hunters. The blue and white flag draped his coffin. Snow fell lightly over the cemetery, as if the land itself had paused to honor him. The White Death was gone, but his legend, like the winter, would never fade. Decades after the Winter War, the story of Simo Häyhä endures not as a tale of bloodshed, but as a lesson in simplicity, precision, and quiet resolve. In a century defined by industrial warfare, he proved that technology and numbers could be defeated by patience and knowledge of the land. Modern snipers and military historians continue to study his methods, how he used snow to mask his breath, how he compacted ice to absorb muzzle flash, how he refused the comfort of optics that could betray his position, what he did by instinct. Today's soldiers are taught as doctrine, yet even among professionals, there's an unspoken awe for how a humble farmer, armed with little more than discipline and courage, turned a frozen wilderness into an impenetrable defense. Häyhä's legacy extends far beyond his record, those 505 confirmed kills that remain unmatched in military history. His story reshaped Finland's national identity. In the decades after the war, as the nation rebuilt from loss and hardship, Simo became a living embodiment of sisu, the Finnish word for inner strength, endurance, and quiet defiance. To his countrymen, he was not a killer, but a symbol of resilience, of how ordinary individuals could rise when history demanded it. His legend offered comfort during difficult times, a reminder that even in the bleakest winters, courage could survive the cold. For the rest of the world, Häyhä's story holds a different kind of power. It challenges the modern perception of warfare, the belief that victory belongs only to those with the biggest armies and the most advanced machines. Simo's war was fought with instinct, not machinery. With patience, not aggression. He demonstrated that the most effective weapon is not always forged from steel, but from focus, clarity, and understanding one's environment. Every shot he fired was deliberate, each a product of discipline honed long before the war, the same discipline that had guided him while farming, hunting, and living quietly under the northern sun. In Finland, his memory remains deeply woven into the nation's fabric. His rifle is preserved in museums, his tactics studied in military academies, and his name taught to schoolchildren as part of their national heritage. Visitors to Karelia, the land he once defended, still speak of him in whispers, a local legend carried by the wind through the pines. On cold winter nights, when the forests fall silent and snow drifts softly across the ground, some say you can almost hear it, the faint echo of a rifle crack in the distance, followed by stillness. The silence that once terrified an empire now feels like reverence. In the end, Simo Häyhä's story is not about war, but about the endurance of the human spirit. He never sought fame, never glorified violence, and never claimed to be extraordinary. Yet, in the darkest winter of his nation's history, he stood his ground, alone, invisible, unwavering. His legacy reminds us that courage is not loud, and heroism is not always grand. Sometimes, it is simply a man lying quietly in the snow, waiting for dawn, doing what must be done. And long after his final breath, his story continues to whisper through the frozen woods of Finland, a reminder that even the coldest silence can echo forever.